Kind enough to join us now is UNC Law professor and the author of a great book that you can go get out wherever books are sold. It's called The Law of Presidential Impeachment, a guide for the engaged citizen. And that's Michael Gerhardt. Mike and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I want to begin with, there's so much that we can ask you about with your subject matter expertise. We actually teased you out a few episodes ago because at the time, the current president, President Biden and the House had announced an impeachment inquiry. We know obviously, this book that you wrote, and obviously you were part of the first Trump impeachment as a witness. I want to get into all of that. But then over the break, Colorado, Maine have taken the former president off of the ballot and former President Trump. I want to get into all that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about your book. Why don't you tell our audience, I mentioned the title at the beginning, but why don't you tell our audience a little bit about it and why you wanted to write it? Because it reads like a guide. It goes through this, cuts through the partisan lens and says, look, this is the law and this is the circumstances around and the history of impeachment.
Well, I appreciate that. So the book, which by the way will be out next week, tries to provide an introduction and overview of the process for presidential impeachment. This is something I've looked at and studied for decades. I've had the privilege of being a witness several times in presidential impeachment proceedings and served as special counsel to Senator Leahy when he was presiding officer in the second Trump impeachment trial. So my hope is the book will provide insights into the law of presidential impeachment from somebody who's not just studied it, but had an opportunity to witness it firsthand. And hopefully it's accessible to everyone. And my hope is not to talk about what's good for Republicans or what's good for Democrats. It's just the basic law. And one great way to think about impeachment is just take the name of the president and the political party of the president out of the equation and just ask yourself, hey, if we had a president who did X or Y, do we think that's an appropriate case for impeachment?
You know, we've seen that there recently now. I mean, we're in the midst of potentially another proceeding, and obviously two with the former president. You know, way back when we started the show, we had Professor Eric Foner on, and we talked about, coming out of the Civil War with Reconstruction, the idea of the impeachment at the time of President Johnson. Going forward, it's the idea of that's a heavy thing to take on. It's a heavy thing. It's the Rubicon in Congress. We've now, however, have seen this used as a blunt tool more frequently. Michael, have we gotten to a place where, because you just mentioned a moment ago that we want to take the politics out of it, take the president out of it, just focus on process. In the work that you're doing, does that seem viable at this point, just considering the political climate?
I think it's necessary. I think it's the only way to get out from under using impeachment as a partisan weapon. Republicans in Congress talk all the time about adhering to original meaning. Well, the original meaning of impeachment is that it's a nonpartisan tool. It is the primary mechanism for holding presidents accountable for their misconduct. It's not there to be used just against a president we don't like, or to be used against only presidents from the other party. That's not what impeachment's about. It is a rarely used mechanism for the most serious kinds of misconduct that a president could commit, typically in office. And in order for that to fulfill its objective, I think we have to look at and focus on the misconduct, which is proven, which demonstrates a serious abuse of power, and not look at the political party or how this will affect a presidential election.
Well, you kind of fed perfectly into the follow-up, because I alluded to it before about how you were a part of the first impeachment of the former president, Donald Trump, with respect to the phone call that he had with Ukraine and the President Zelensky right now, who's going through a war effort. And we know about why those funds were so essential in the lead up to all of this. I would love for you to, and you kind of dive into both impeachments in the book, but I would love for you, for our audience, and giving away some of the book, of course, kind of put to rest about the political motivations and taking that out. Is the former president, when he was impeached the two times he were Was it justified? Were they politically motivated? Given the facts and circumstances, did what the former president do rise to that level of high crimes and misdemeanors? And what says the UNC Law professor who wrote a book about this subject matter?
Well, of course, I testified in the 2019 impeachment hearings against President Trump. And what I said there is what I still believe, and that is that President Trump committed impeachable offenses. Something to keep in mind is that President Trump is really responsible for those impeachments. It's because his misconduct was proven, and it's not a matter of fiction. It's not a matter of partisan belief or hatred. So President Trump is the one that abused power. He's the one involved in that phone call with the president of Ukraine. He's the one that refused to comply with subpoenas that Congress sent him for responses regarding his conduct regarding Ukraine and the president of Ukraine. And we might recall what President Trump wanted to do at that time in 2019 was he wanted the president of Ukraine to issue a false narrative. He wanted that president of Ukraine to simply announce a criminal investigation into Joe Biden for conduct relating to Burisma, which is a company that his son Hunter was involved with. Guess what? That theory, that narrative was disproven at the time. It's the same narrative the Republicans in Congress are pushing now. It hasn't gotten proven since then, but instead it serves a political purpose for Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump has asked Republicans to impeach Biden because, as Trump says, it happened to me. No, it happened to President Trump not because of made up stuff, but because of serious abuse of power. And then in January 6th, something everybody knows about from real video, not doctored video, from video that we all watched in real time. And the members of Congress are there in real time. And they knew that there was a storming of the Capitol, violence directed against the Capitol by Donald Trump. And that's why 7 senators broke from their party to convict Trump in that second trial. That's the largest number of senators from a president's party to vote to convict that president of misconduct.
Staying with the topic of impeachable offenses for a moment, it was noted that some Republicans had came forward, and in the conversation about this upcoming impeachment, when asked to provide facts or anecdotals like evidence to why moving forward, it seemed as though, not it seemed, I mean, it was documented that it was a struggle to generate that. In your book, there's a conversation about like how do you prepare the materials before moving forward. From what you're seeing with this initial push from Republicans for this current impeachment process, where is it in violation to the core principles and really what should be happening in an impeachment process? Is this a case of Republicans not really following process and trying to get to the point like the former president has spoken of and asked for? Or are they still well within the appropriate guidelines of moving forward in an impeachment inquiry?
I think they've left the Constitution behind. I think that they are trying to gut impeachment. They're trying to remove it as any kind of serious mechanism for presidential impeachment. And don't believe me, the Republicans' own experts said in the one hearing held on President Biden's possible impeachment that there was no evidence yet of any impeachable misconduct. That was said in late September. No fact-finding has been done since then regarding Joe Biden. There's lots of hyperbole regarding Hunter, and there's lots of wishful and hateful thinking about Joe Biden, but that's not a substitute for real evidence. Had there been real evidence, the process would have looked different. That's what we had with Richard Nixon, for example. There were months of evidence compiled in the House, the Senate, and by a special prosecutor. All that evidence showed the same thing, that Richard Nixon was abusing his power. In 2019, the House Intelligence Committee pulled together weeks of intensive fact-finding that was done with witnesses from within the Trump administration. Numbers of people who actually Trump appointed were the ones who were testifying about his misconduct. And if we fast forward to 2021, the second impeachment trial of President Trump, that too wasn't something concocted. We all saw the videos, and we all saw the damage. And we all heard President Trump's speech. And we hear, even today, President Trump putting forward the big lie that he somehow won the presidential election in 2020. We all know that's false. Congress knew it was false. That's the way they certified the election ultimately for Joe Biden. So the Republicans who are pushing for Biden's impeachment are the same people who don't believe Donald Trump has ever done anything wrong. And that blasts their credibility. What we want and need in an impeachment process is credibility, not vindictiveness, not partisanship, but credibility. And that starts with the evidence.
Couldn't agree more. And you do go into depth about the Richard Nixon process in your book. Like I said, you can go get that book wherever it's sold. I did want to pivot because we were talking about this at the top of this segment about some questions we wanted to ask you around the former president now being taken off the ballot in Colorado and in Maine. I know recently he has asked, his lawyers have asked the U.S. Supreme Court kind of take on the case in Colorado and what the Colorado Supreme Court in a 4-3 decision ruled in terms of removing him off the ballot. You and I were talking before we came on air about how everyone now knows Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and we're going to find out the application of this law and how it's interpreted, because the former president's not charged with insurrection. He's charged with obstructing an official proceeding. And all the legal beagles on TV, including a friend of the show, Ellie Honig, former federal prosecutor and CNN legal analyst, and John Avalon, a political analyst for CNN, they were engaged in a morning debate about Colorado and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And I said, well, I know somebody who can kind of break this down and tell us if they're right and wrong in their arguments. So I want you to take a listen to this, and we're going to react on the other side. So take a listen.
And here's where I think the problem comes in with the ruling we got from the Colorado Supreme Court yesterday. Even if we take it as a given that Donald Trump engaged in an insurrection, and I'm willing to sign on to that given all the facts, I think quite clearly, we still don't know, even as we sit here now, we don't know how this works. We don't know who gets to decide whether a person engaged in insurrection. We didn't know 100 years ago. We didn't know yesterday. We don't know now. The problem is the Constitution tells us how we're supposed to know. The 14th Amendment says, Section 5, Congress is supposed to pass laws telling us how this works. Congress has not done that. And so what Colorado did is they sort of made up this procedure. They had this quasi hearing over 5 days. And now the Supreme Court of Colorado, by a 4-3 margin, is saying, good enough. He's out. That is a violation of due process. And that is why I think that this ruling from the Colorado Supreme Court is going to be struck down.
The Constitution says what it says. The Colorado Supreme Court decided that the Constitution still matters and it applies to Donald Trump. The 14th Amendment, Section 3, specifically says, we had the language up there, that no person who took an oath to uphold the Constitution and engages in insurrection or rebellion or gives aid or comfort to said insurrection or rebellion is eligible to hold any office. That's the language. Any office, civil or federal. And people can parse, well, was it anticipated to be under a president? I know if you read the articles, the debates around the ratification, senators at that time are saying this is also forward-looking. This is not just about the Confederacy and the U.S. Civil War.
All right. So you heard a little bit there of their back and forth. Obviously, Ellie pointing to due process. And Donald Trump maybe not getting that. Obviously, John talking about what the amendment, what the section in the amendment actually says about holding public office and giving aid or comfort to anybody participating in an insurrection. First, I would love to get from you kind of a breakdown of what they're arguing against and the merits of each of their arguments. And then as this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, as of this taping, they have not weighed in on it. Where do you think it nets out? And do you think they weigh in and set a precedent that other states, depending upon where they lean and their legislatures lean, could actually, take either Joe Biden or President Trump off of the ballots?
Well, I know both Ellie and John, and I respect them both. And each of them has a point to be made. Ellie, who was the first speaker, makes the point, which I think is right, that we just don't know for sure how Section 3 is supposed to be implemented. We know the language, that's what John points out. The language is pretty straightforward. And so what we've got to figure out is, first, how should Section 3 apply? Who applies it? Who makes the determination about insurrection or rebellion? And then we also have to figure out does it apply to the president? So now we go beyond their statements back to the law. Section 3 does not reference the president expressly. And there's this question whether or not the presidency itself is covered by Section 3, because Section 3 mentions senators, representatives, and officers of the United States. So the question before the Supreme Court will not be about due process. The question before the Supreme Court will be, is the president an officer of the United States such that the president, would be covered by Section 3? There are Supreme Court decisions suggesting officers of the United States work under the president. And the presidency itself is not necessarily an office of the United States, but instead a unique office. So the Supreme Court could rule that the presidency itself is not affected or covered by Section 3. I think that's what a lot of people might expect the Supreme Court to do, especially because there's several justices appointed by President Trump who are likely to rule in a way that will please him. The counter argument to that sort of takes off from where John left off, and that has to do with the plain language of Section 3 and the fact that it would be an absurd reading of Section 3 not to include the president. It includes everybody else, but somehow it overlooks the presidency. That would be absurd in the aftermath of the Civil War if the narrow reading of Section 3 that doesn't apply to the president prevails. Then we could expect the absurd result back after the Civil War of Jefferson Davis running for the presidency. Nothing blocking him from being president, being elected, or serving. And that is not what the framers of the 14th Amendment wanted. That would be an absurd result, and I think it's not a result consistent with what we know about Section 3.
Michael, does a precedent like that run the risk of then disrupting previous decisions or conversations that that the court has brought up, of the idea that if the presidency is viewed as a separate office? We heard this a little bit in the form of confidential documents, that these like the Espionage Act, for example. I think it's the Espionage Act I'm thinking of. But the documents that were found in the former president's, in the estate, that was an argument of like, this doesn't apply to him. So do we run the risk of, or is the precedent possibly that there's essentially an exclusion of the president from, I guess almost unless the role is named in the Constitution?
Well, I think we've got to keep the big picture in mind, because if the Trump arguments work, Section 3 doesn't apply to me, the espionage doesn't apply to me, I can't be held liable in impeachment because I'm the law. If those arguments from Trump are correct, then we reach the conclusion that as long as the president is Donald Trump, he's above the law. And by the way, that's exactly what the framers opposed. They created a constitution in which no one was above the law. So anything that would lead to the conclusion that the presidency, again, only occupied by Donald Trump, guess what? If it's occupied by Joe Biden, Republicans say, oh, every law in the world applies to him. Well, that tells us there's no principle involved in their activity. But if there's a principle involved, it applies no matter who holds the office. It applies equally to everyone who occupies the presidency. And that means, in effect, no one is above the law. And so I think as far as Donald Trump is concerned, the law applies to him, not just when he's president, but particularly after he's president. This is the mistake Trump makes. Trump argues, and his lawyers argue, somehow, as an ex-president, he's entitled to all the same privileges that the current president is entitled to. There's no such rule in American law. We have only one president at a time. Donald Trump may not like it, but Joe Biden fairly won the presidency. He fairly occupies the presidency, and he is currently the president of the United States. That's a fact, and the law supports that fact. Donald Trump wants to be a king, but our Constitution doesn't allow for that. So that's his frustration.
You know, keeping on theme, because Colorado wasn't the only state that did this, but Colorado obviously went through the judiciary, whereas in Maine, we recently saw the Secretary of State removing the former president from, or barring, excuse me, the former president from the state's ballot. And we'll see how that plays out in the courts. Given the familiarity that maybe you have with what the Secretary of State did, can you kind of explain to our audience why she did that? There was calls from Trump's lawyers for her to recuse herself from doing this because of some biases. Is there anything to that argument? Where do you see this playing out as well? And will the Colorado decision, if it goes before the Supreme Court, could that factor into what happens in Maine?
There's no credibility and legitimacy at all to the Trump arguments that the Secretary of State of Maine should somehow be disqualified because she's not a Trump lover. She is rightfully the Secretary of State. Doesn't matter what her political party is. And so she's entitled to exercise the powers of that office. One of the powers of that office is to determine the eligibility of people who want to be on the ballot. And she's made a determination within the scope of her power that Trump is not qualified to be on the ballot because he violates the terms of Section 3. That's a reasonable construction of Section 3. It was a construction by a state board back here in North Carolina in a case that involved Matthew Cawthorn that was decided several years ago. But if we fast forward back to the present, what we're concerned with is facts and the law. Those should not depend on partisanship. And the fact is that Donald Trump did what he did on January 6th. And by the way, there was a huge lead-in to January 6th. He was trying mightily to undermine the process for confirming the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. He's still trying to undermine that process. But the facts are that Biden won the presidency fair and square. He's the president. And if there's evidence of serious wrongdoing by Joe Biden, that would be featured in an impeachment inquiry. The difficulty here is there are no facts to support that. Republicans themselves have said there's no evidence. Republican expert witnesses have said there's no evidence. So if they say there's no evidence, I'm willing to agree with them on that point.
Speaking of the facts and the law, you can go get that book that I mentioned before that you wrote. It's out now wherever books are sold. I think as of this taping coming out, the book is out there. It's called The Law of Presidential Impeachment, a guide for the engaged citizen. One thing we like to do with authors that come on this show, Professor Gerhardt, is somebody's at Barnes & Noble or a local bookstore. They see the book, they pick it up. You happen to be over their right shoulder. You tap on them and you go, hey, I wrote that book. Give them the elevator pitch of why they should go up to the register and purchase the book.
Well, I appreciate that. My hope is that the book will be a useful introduction to the actual law of presidential impeachment and to the actual process that the Constitution sets up for holding presidents accountable for their misconduct. That's the point of the book. The point of the book is not to reward one party or another, but it's simply to get the law straight. So anyone interested in getting the law straight would benefit from reading the book.
There you go. And that's what I like about the book. You know, nonpartisan, just cutting to it with respect to the laws. Professor Gerhardt, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program, giving us a couple minutes. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And you stay safe as well.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.